Spring, 1952. The back room of Lido's restaurant on 116th Street and Pleasant Avenue, the heart of Italian Harlem. 11 men sat around a table covered in whiskey bottles, ashtrays, and stacks of cash waiting to be counted. The air was thick with cigar smoke and tension that had been building for 3 weeks. At precisely 9:47 p.m., everything changed. A man named Joseph Joe Bats Battaglino, 6'2", 230 pounds of Genovese family muscle, stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor like a gunshot. He crossed the room in 3 strides and grabbed Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, by the collar of his tailored suit jacket, yanking him half out of his seat. The room went silent. Not the kind of silence where people pause to listen. The kind where nobody breathes, where hands instinctively move toward waistbands. Where the next 5 seconds will determine whether everyone walks out alive or whether this night becomes a massacre that rewrites the power structure of New York City. Bumpy Johnson, the most feared man in Harlem, the strategist who'd negotiated with Lucky Luciano himself, the man who'd survived 4 decades in a business where most died before 30, didn't move, didn't flinch, just looked up at Joe Bats with those calculating eyes that had stared down Dutch Schultz, the police, and every other threat that had ever come his way. What happened in those next 10 seconds would define the relationship between Black and Italian organized crime in New York for the next 2 decades. But to understand why this moment was so dangerous, why Joe Bats grabbing Bumpy's collar was potentially a death sentence for everyone in that room, you need to understand what had been happening in the 3 weeks leading up to this night. You need to understand the numbers, the territories, the betrayals, and most importantly, you need to understand that in 1952, the partnership between Harlem's Black operators and the Italian mob families was held together by nothing more than mutual profit and carefully maintained respect. Joe Bats had just shattered that respect. And Bumpy Johnson, the man who'd built an empire on strategic patience, had maybe 5 seconds to decide whether to kill him for it. To understand the collision that was coming, you have to understand the business. And in 1952, the business was numbers. The illegal lottery system known as policy or the numbers game generated an estimated $100 million annually in New York City alone. Every day, hundreds of thousands of people, mostly working-class Black and Puerto Rican residents, placed small bets on 3-digit numbers. If your number hit, you won 600 to 1 odds. The house kept roughly 40% of the total handle. The rest went to winners, runners, collectors, and the men at the top. In Harlem, those men at the top included Bumpy Johnson. But it wasn't that simple. Bumpy didn't own the numbers. Nobody did. It was a network, an ecosystem. Black operators like Bumpy controlled the street-level operations, the runners who collected bets, the drop houses where money was counted, the bankers who managed cash flow. But the Italian families, particularly the Genovese and Luciano organizations, provided the political protection, the connections to judges and police captains, and the muscle needed to prevent competitors from moving in. It was a partnership born in the 1930s when Lucky Luciano helped Black operators push out Dutch Schultz's violent takeover attempt. The agreement was clear. Black operators managed Harlem. Italians provided protection and infrastructure. Profits were split 60-40 in favor of the Italians. Not because they earned it, but because they had the power to take it if they wanted. By 1952, that arrangement had held for nearly 20 years. But cracks were forming. The Italian families were consolidating power after years of federal pressure. The Kefauver hearings in 1951 had exposed organized crime on a national scale, putting heat on mob operations across the country. The families needed more money to pay lawyers, bribe officials, and maintain control. That meant taking bigger cuts from their existing operations, including the numbers. In February 1952, representatives from the Genovese family approached several Harlem operators with a new proposal. The split would change to 50-50. No negotiation, no discussion. The Italians were taking more because they could. Most operators accepted. They had no choice. The alternative was being shut down completely or worse. Bumpy Johnson refused. Not loudly, not dramatically, He simply told the Genovese representatives, politely but firmly, that the existing arrangement worked, that Harlem's operations were efficient because black operators understood their community, that changing the split would destabilize everything, that he'd continue operating under the original terms until they could negotiate properly. It was the kind of refusal that required enormous confidence, or enormous miscalculation. The Genovese family sent word back through their usual channels. This wasn't a negotiation. The split changes. Everyone complies, including Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy sent word back. Come discuss in person. That's how the meeting at Lido's restaurant was arranged for April 3rd, 1952. Neutral territory, Italian Harlem, but a public place. 5 representatives from the Genovese family. 5 from Harlem's black operators, including Bumpy, and 1 mediator, Stephanie St. Clair, the legendary Queenie, who'd fought her own war with Dutch Schultz and still commanded respect from both sides. Everyone understood the stakes. This meeting would either preserve the partnership or destroy it. And if it destroyed it, the war that followed would be catastrophic. What nobody expected was Joe Bats. The Genovese representatives arrived first. That was intentional. Psychological advantage, subtle intimidation. By the time Bumpy and his people walked through the door at 9:15 p.m., the Italians had already claimed the best positions around the table. Leading the Genovese delegation was Anthony "Tony" Bender Strollo, a capo in his early 50s, sophisticated, politically connected, and responsible for managing the family's interests in Harlem and the Bronx. Tony Bender was known for being reasonable when he could be and ruthless when he had to be. He preferred negotiation to bloodshed, but only because negotiation was cheaper. Beside him sat Dominic the Gap Petrilli, called that because of the space between his front teeth, which made his smile unsettling. The Gap handled enforcement. When someone needed to be convinced through physical persuasion, he was the one who did the convincing. He'd been arrested 17 times for assault, convicted twice, served less than 3 years total. That's how protection worked. Then there was Salvatore Sally Burns Granello, a soldier who managed protection rackets in East Harlem. Quiet, observant, dangerous in the way that smart soldiers are dangerous. He didn't speak unless he had something important to say, which meant when he did speak, people listened. Vincent Chin Gigani was there too, younger than the others, only in his mid-20s, but already rising fast. He'd later become one of the most powerful mob bosses in American history. But in 1952, he was still learning, still watching, still figuring out how power really worked. And Joe Bats, Joseph Battaglino, the muscle, the enforcer, the man who'd broken legs, smashed kneecaps, and allegedly killed at least 3 men on behalf of the Genovese family. Joe Bats was there to make sure everyone remembered that negotiations could end very badly if they went wrong. Representing Harlem, Bumpy Johnson, obviously. Alongside him was Ellsworth Nat Pettigrew, his longtime advisor and community liaison. Junie Bird, who handled legal connections. Red Campbell, the numbers banker. And Stephanie St. Clair herself, 62 years old by then, semi-retired, but still sharp as a blade. Stephanie insisted on being there. She'd been through this before, the territorial disputes, the power struggles, the moments when everything balanced on the edge of violence. She knew both sides. She knew how to translate between cultures, between languages of power that sounded similar but meant different things. The meeting started civil. Tony Bender laid out the Genovese position. Operating costs were rising. Federal pressure meant more money needed for protection. The split had to change to reflect the new reality. It was business, nothing personal. Bumpy responded calmly. He acknowledged the pressure, acknowledged the costs, but he explained that Harlem's numbers operation functioned because of community trust. The runners, the collectors, the players, they trusted black operators. Change too much too fast, and that trust collapses. Revenue drops. Everyone loses. He proposed a compromise, a gradual adjustment over 2 years. Small increases in the Italian percentage each quarter until they reached an equitable middle ground. Everyone adapts. Nobody gets hurt. It was reasonable, smart. The kind of solution that benefits everyone. Tony Bender listened, nodded thoughtfully. Then he said, the split changes now. 50-50, starting next week. That's when the temperature in the room dropped. Bumpy leaned back in his chair, lit a cigarette, let smoke curl toward the ceiling while he thought. That's not sustainable, he said finally. You're asking me to cut my people's income by 25% overnight. They won't accept it. And if they don't accept it, they'll stop cooperating. You'll have to send your people into Harlem to collect. And your people don't know Harlem. Then make them accept it, the Gap said, smiling his unsettling smile. I don't force my people, Bumpy replied. I lead them. There's a difference. Maybe that's the problem, the Gap continued. Maybe you're too soft. Stephanie St. Clair cut in before Bumpy could respond. Gentlemen, let's remember why we're here. We've had a profitable arrangement for 2 decades. Throwing that away over 10 percentage points is foolish. It's not about percentages, Tony Bender said. It's about respect, about understanding how things work. We provide the protection. We take the risks. We deserve the larger share. You take the risks? Red Campbell spoke up for the first time. Our people get arrested. Our people get beaten by police. You people make phone calls. The temperature dropped further. Vincent Chin Gigani leaned forward. Careful how you talk. Or what? Red shot back. That's when Joe Batts stood up. Joe Batts wasn't supposed to be part of the discussion. He was there as security, as presence, as a silent reminder of consequences. Enforcers don't negotiate. They enforce. But Joe Batts was also ambitious. Young for an enforcer, only 31, and hungry to prove himself. Hungry to show the bosses he was more than just muscle, that he understood power dynamics, that he could command respect. So when Red Campbell challenged Vincent Gigani, Joe Batts saw an opportunity. He stood, crossed the room, and grabbed Bumpy Johnson by the collar. You don't talk to us like that, Joe Batts said, his voice low and threatening. You're in our territory. You remember that. The room froze. Nat Pettigrew's hand moved toward his waistband. The Gap's hand did the same. Stephanie St. Clair closed her eyes briefly, not in fear, but in the resignation of someone watching a disaster unfold that they can't stop. Bumpy Johnson didn't move. He just looked at Joe Batts, stared into his eyes with an expression that wasn't anger or fear. It was calculation, assessment, the look of a man running through every possible outcome of the next few seconds and deciding which one best serve his interests. Let go, Bumpy said quietly. Or what? Joe Batts tightened his grip. What happened next would be debated for years. Some witnesses said Bumpy never changed his expression. Others said they saw something flicker in his eyes. Not fear, but recognition. Recognition that the partnership had just ended. That the pretense of respect and mutual benefit was gone. That everything would be different from this moment forward. Tony Bender stood quickly. Joe, sit down. I'm making a point, Joe Batts said, not letting go of Bumpy's collar. You're making a mistake, Tony said sharply. Sit down. For 3 heartbeats, Joe Batts didn't move. He'd committed to the gesture. Backing down now would look weak. But holding on meant escalating. And escalation meant blood. Tony Bender's voice cut through the tension. Joseph, this is the last time I'll ask. Joe Batts released Bumpy's collar. Step back. Sat down. But the damage was done. Bumpy adjusted his collar slowly, deliberately. Then he stood. This meeting is over, he said calmly. We're not finished, Tony Bender replied. Yes, we are. Bumpy looked around the table, meeting each Italian representative's eyes. You sent an enforcer to put hands on me. That's not negotiation. That's intimidation. And I don't do business with people who think intimidation works on me. You don't have a choice, the Gap said. You'll accept the new terms, or what? Bumpy cut him off. You'll shut me down? You'll take over Harlem operations yourselves? Go ahead. Try. See how long your runners last. See how much money you collect when every drop house, every collector, every player in Harlem knows you've forced out the people they trust. You're threatening us? Vincent Gigani asked, his voice dangerous. I'm explaining economics, Bumpy said. You could take Harlem by force. But you'll be taking empty territory. The money won't be there anymore. Because the money isn't in the streets or the drop houses. It's in the trust. And you just showed everyone in this room that trust means nothing to you. He turned to leave. Nat, Red, Junie, and Stephanie stood with him. If you walk out that door, Tony Bender said, his voice hard now, the partnership ends. Permanently. Bumpy paused. Look back. It ended, he said quietly, the second your man put his hands on me. They walked out. Behind them, the Italians sat in stunned silence. Tony Bender's face was carved from stone. The Gap was smiling that terrible smile. Joe Batts looked confused, like he didn't understand what he'd done wrong. Vincent Chin Gigani stared at the door Bumpy had walked through and said, so quietly only Tony Bender heard, we just made a very dangerous enemy. What followed wasn't a gang war, not in the traditional sense. There were no shootouts, no bodies in the streets, no newspaper headlines screaming about mob violence. Instead, there was something colder, more strategic, more devastating in its precision. Bumpy Johnson went back to Harlem and called a meeting of every major black operator in the neighborhood. 23 men gathered at Small's Paradise on the night of April 5th, 2 days after the Lido's incident. Bumpy laid out what had happened. The disrespect, the ultimatum, the choice. We can accept their terms, Bumpy said. Take the smaller cut. Keep operating under Italian protection. That's the safe move. That's what they expect. You let that sit for a moment. Or we can prove we don't need them. The room erupted in argument. Some operators thought cutting ties with the Italians was suicide. The mob had police protection, political connections, muscle. Fighting them would be a war nobody could win. Others, particularly the younger operators, were tired of paying tribute to families that contributed nothing but threats. Bumpy let them argue for 20 minutes. Then he raised his hand. The room quieted. Here's what we do, he said. We operate independently. Completely. No Italian protection. No Italian muscle. No Italian connections. We handle our own security. We make our own political arrangements. We keep 100% of the profits. And when the Italians retaliate, someone asked. They won't, Bumpy said, because we're going to make it more expensive to fight us than to leave us alone. He explained his strategy. It was brilliant in its simplicity. First, diversify operations. The numbers game would continue, but Bumpy would also expand into other businesses, legitimate and otherwise. Nightclubs, real estate, loan operations. If the Italians shut down one revenue stream, others would replace it. Second, political connections. Bumpy already had relationships with certain politicians and police officials, relationships he'd built independently over decades. He'd strengthen those, make them exclusive, give them reasons to protect Harlem interests over Italian interests. Third, community support. This was the crucial element. Bumpy would position the split as Harlem taking control of its own destiny. Not criminals fighting criminals, but a community refusing to pay tribute to outsiders. Make it about pride, about self-determination, about respect. Fourth, strategic restraint. No violence against Italian operations. No provocations. No public conflicts. Just quiet, efficient independence. Force the Italians to be the aggressors if they wanted war. And make sure everyone, the police, the politicians, the press, knew who started it. It was risky, audacious, the kind of strategy that either elevates you or destroys you. 20 of the 23 operators agreed to try. The 3 who didn't immediately went to the Italians and reported everything, which Bumpy had expected. That's why he'd held back certain details, like the fact that he'd already secured alternative police protection through a captain in the 32nd Precinct who was tired of splitting bribes with Italian bagmen, or that he'd arranged for several journalists at the Amsterdam News to cover any violence that erupted, framing it as mob intimidation of black businesses. Bumpy Johnson had been playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. The Genovese family's response came within a week. Tony Bender sent word. Any Harlem operator who continued working with Bumpy would be cut off from Italian protection. Their businesses would be vulnerable. Their safety couldn't be guaranteed. It was a threat designed to fracture Bumpy's coalition. Instead, it strengthened it, because Bumpy had already prepared for this. He'd hired independent security, former boxers, ex-military men, people with no mob connections. He'd moved money into legitimate accounts that couldn't be seized. He diversified his operations so thoroughly that shutting down one aspect wouldn't cripple him. And most importantly, he made sure that every attack on a Harlem business, every act of intimidation, every muscle move by Italian enforcers would be documented, publicized, and framed as racial oppression. The Italians had power, but Bumpy had narrative. And in 1952, with the civil rights movement beginning to gather momentum, with media attention focused on racial injustice, with politicians needing black votes in increasingly important districts, narrative was becoming as powerful as muscle. The Genovese family realized too late that they'd walked into a trap. 3 months after the Lido's restaurant incident, the situation reached a breaking point. The Italians had tried subtle pressure. It hadn't worked. They'd tried economic warfare, threatening businesses that worked with Bumpy's people. Some businesses folded. Most didn't. They'd tried political pressure, leaning on their police and judicial contacts. But Bumpy's political network held firm. By July 1952, the Genovese family faced an uncomfortable reality. They were losing Harlem without firing a shot. Tony Bender called another meeting. This time, he came alone. No enforcers, no soldiers, no muscle. Just him and Bumpy Johnson, meeting at a neutral location, a warehouse on the west side controlled by neither Harlem nor Italian interests. It was a bold move. Vulnerable. The kind of meeting where violence could erupt with no witnesses. But Tony Bender was smart enough to know that violence wasn't the solution anymore. According to later accounts, some confirmed, some speculative, the conversation lasted 43 minutes. Tony opened by acknowledging the mistake. Joe Batts was out of line. He was disciplined. Bumpy said nothing. The partnership worked for 20 years, Tony continued. It made everyone money. It kept the peace. Throwing that away over one man's stupidity is wasteful. It wasn't about Joe Batts, Bumpy replied. It was about what he represented. The assumption that you could treat us, with that kind of disrespect, and we'd just accept it. Business requires hierarchy, Tony said. Business requires mutual respect, Bumpy countered. You want a bigger cut? Fine, that's negotiable. But you try to take it through intimidation rather than negotiation. That's not business. That's extortion. Tony nodded slowly. So what do you want? I want what I've always wanted. A fair arrangement. Recognition that Harlem operators are partners, not subordinates. And I want to guarantee that nobody puts hands on me or mine again without consequences. What kind of consequences? The kind that end careers, Bumpy said. You discipline your people. I'll discipline mine. We maintain respect. Both ways. Tony considered this. And the split. 60-40, original terms. But with one addition, annual review. If circumstances change, if your costs genuinely increase or our revenue changes, we negotiate adjustments. Like adults. You realize I can't go back to my people with the same terms we had before, Tony said. Not after 3 months of conflict. They'll see it as weakness. Then frame it differently, Bumpy replied. You secured peace in Harlem without bloodshed. You maintained profitable operations during federal scrutiny. You showed strategic patience instead of brutal reaction. That's not weakness. That's leadership. Tony Bender smiled slightly. You'd make a good Italian. I'd make a terrible Italian, Bumpy said. But I make an excellent partner. When treated like one. They shook hands. The agreement was finalized over the next 2 weeks. The 60-40 split remained. Annual reviews were written into the arrangement, though everyone knew they'd never actually happen. Most importantly, there was a new clause. Any act of physical intimidation against an operator on either side, without approval from both leaderships, will be considered a violation punishable by the offending side. It was elegant. It protected everyone, and it saved face. Joe Batts, the man whose grab had started everything, was quietly removed from Harlem operations. According to mob historians, he was reassigned to the Bronx, then to New Jersey, then eventually to Florida. He never rose higher than soldier. His moment of ambition, his attempt to assert dominance, had permanently marked him as unreliable. A man who couldn't read a room. who couldn't understand that power isn't about physical dominance. It's about knowing when to use it and when to hold back. He grabbed Bumpy Johnson's collar, trying to prove his strength. Instead, he'd proven his weakness. The story of Joe Bats grabbing Bumpy Johnson became legend in both Harlem and mob circles, though the details were often distorted in the retelling. Some versions claim Bumpy had broken Joe Bats' hand in response. Others said the room erupted into a brawl that left 3 men dead. Still others insisted it never happened at all, just another myth in a world built on myths. But the people who were there, the ones who survived long enough to tell the story, confirmed the essential truth. Joe Bats grabbed Bumpy's collar. The room went silent, and the consequences of that moment rippled through New York's organized crime landscape for decades. Because what happened at Lido's restaurant in April 1952 wasn't really about a physical confrontation. It was about respect, about the invisible lines that separate partnership from subjugation, about the moment when a man decides whether to accept disrespect for the sake of safety or reject it at the risk of everything. Bumpy Johnson chose rejection, and he did it smartly, not with immediate violence, but with strategic patience. He walked out. He built alternatives. He forced the other side to choose between endless conflict and honorable compromise. And when they chose compromise, he made sure the terms protected everyone's dignity. That's leadership. That's power. Not the grabbing someone's collar kind. The kind that changes systems without destroying them. The kind that wins wars without firing shots. Tony Bender would later say, according to FBI wiretaps from 1956, that negotiating with Bumpy Johnson was like playing chess against someone who's thinking 6 moves ahead while you're still figuring out the board. It wasn't a complaint. It was admiration. Bumpy Johnson continued operating in Harlem until his death in 1968. The partnership with the Italian families held, not perfectly, but functionally. There were disputes, tensions, occasional violations. But there was never another Lido's restaurant moment, because both sides understood what that moment had taught them. That respect isn't given based on muscle alone. It's earned through intelligence, strategy, and the willingness to risk everything when principles are violated. If you've made it this far into the story, you understand something important about power that most people never learn. Real power isn't loud. It isn't aggressive. It isn't about who's biggest or strongest or most violent. Real power is about understanding systems, building alternatives, and knowing when to walk away from a bad deal. Bumpy Johnson understood that. Joe Bats didn't. And that's why one of them became a legend, while the other became a cautionary tale. The grab lasted maybe 5 seconds, but its consequences shaped decades. That's how power works. Not in the moment of contact, but in everything that comes after. In the choices made, the restraint shown, the intelligence applied, in understanding that sometimes the strongest response to physical intimidation is to simply walk away and let your absence do more damage than your presence ever could. Bumpy Johnson walked out of Lido's restaurant that night knowing exactly what he was doing. He was ending a partnership on his terms. He was forcing a renegotiation from a position of strength. He was teaching everyone in that room, Italian and black alike, that you don't maintain power by accepting disrespect. You maintain it by making disrespect too expensive for anyone to attempt. And for the rest of his life, nobody grabbed Bumpy Johnson's collar again.